Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take your sources, unpack the key ideas, and hopefully give you that shortcut to being well-informed.
Yeah, hopefully.
Today, we're looking at a really striking contrast, something quite different from what many Western countries have experienced. The question is, why does Japan seem, well, almost immune to the kind of Islamic terror attacks we've unfortunately seen elsewhere?
That's the core question, yeah. And we're drawing this from a specific source provided to us, titled Excerpts from Japan, No Country for Islam, Here's Why.mp3.
And right off the bat, this source highlights that contrast. I mean, it lists attacks all over France, Germany, London, Brussels, Madrid, Paris, even Volgograd, Beslan, Moscow.
All kinds, right. Truck attacks, bombs, suicide attacks, execution squads. The source claims hundreds of lives lost.
It even brings up that quote attributed to London Mayor Sadiq Khan.
Oh, yeah, the one about Islamic terror attacks being part and parcel of life in a big city.
Exactly. And the source immediately puts that right next to the situation in Tokyo, which, as it notes, is the world's largest city, and other big Japanese cities.
Places where, according to this source, these kinds of attacks just haven't happened.
Right. So, okay, our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. Let's get into this specific source and really try to understand its perspective on why this difference exists. What's the argument it's making?
Okay, so the source sort of builds its case starting with Japanese identity, how Japanese culture, in its view, sees outsiders.
And it talks about a kind of binary, a split.
Exactly. A binary dichotomy is the phrase it uses. It argues there's this fundamental division. You're either Japanese or non-Japanese. Pretty simple, according to them.
And crucially, the source claims this isn't just about, where you were born or what you look like.
No, not at all. It argues this extends to people who hold what the source calls non-Japanese ideas or follow non-Japanese religions.
Okay, so it's deeper than just nationality. Yeah. And it uses an example to illustrate this.
It does. It points to the Korean population in Japan. It says there are about 700,000 Koreans living there.
700,000.
Okay. And here's the kicker. According to the source, 3/4 of them born and raised in Japan.
Wow. But still legally.
Still legally classified, most of them, as resident aliens. And the source states they make up something like 85% of all resident aliens in Japan.
So the vast majority.
Right. And the source claims that even people into their 4th generation, they're called Zainichi Korean, who might, only speak Japanese, never lived anywhere else. They're still seen as outsiders. That's the source's assertion.
Okay. And then the source draws a contrast with the West.
It does, yeah. It claims Western countries are taking in immigrants from what it terms backward countries, and even predicts native populations becoming minorities by mid-century. So it's really framing this inside-outsider view as fundamentally different in Japan.
Got it. So that's the cultural backdrop the source paints. How does it then connect this to the actual Muslim population in Japan?
Well, first it makes a point that Japan doesn't officially track religion or ethnicity in its stats. The source says this is because it's never been necessary.
Which the source implies is significant in itself.
Right. But it does cite some estimates from Japanese scholars, Hiroshi Koima and Kiyo Sakurai. Their figure is around 70,000 Muslims in total.
70,000. And the breakdown of that, according to the source?
It suggests maybe 90% are foreign residents, people from other countries living in Japan.
Okay.
And about 10%, maybe 7,000 or so, are native Japanese people who've converted.
So if you run the numbers, that 70,000 figure, what percentage of Japan's total population is that based on the source?
It comes out to about 0.05%. 0.05%?
That is tiny.
Very, very small. That's the clear conclusion the source draws. Very, very few Muslims.
Okay, so the source has laid out a cultural view that clearly separates Japanese from non-Japanese, including ideas, religions, it argues, and a statistically, almost negligible Muslim population.
Yeah.
How does it link these to Japan's security posture, its approach to terrorism?
The source argues that Japan has basically watched what it calls the havoc, devastation, and violence that political Islam has brought elsewhere.
It lists a lot of places.
Yeah, North America, Europe, Russia, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, Western China, Southeast Asia, pretty much globally. And because they've seen this, the source claims Japan is just unwilling to take chances.
Unwilling to take chances. And that means?
That means, according to the source, Japan refuses to allow Islam and Islamists a free rein in the name of tolerance and political correctness.
Which the source explicitly contrasts with the West. It claims that is what happens in Western countries.
Yes, that's the direct comparison it makes. And this leads into another specific point the source raises about the concept of Islamophobia.
Right. How does the source define that?
It defines it as an irrational fear of the doctrines of Islam, which then gets equated to a people and called racism. That's the source's definition.
And its claim is that this concept
Is not recognized as a legitimate concept in Japan. It just doesn't have traction there, according to the source.
and it goes even broader than that, doesn't it? About racism itself.
It does. It makes the rather sweeping claim that for many in Japan, the very idea of racism is still seen as a foreign idea inapplicable to Japanese society.
Okay, so the source is drawing a line here. From that binary cultural view to the non-recognition of concepts like Islamophobia or even racism as domestically relevant, which it argues impacts how potential issues related to outsiders are handled, or perhaps not handled in the way they might be elsewhere.
That seems to be the connection the source is making, yes. And then it gets into some specific incidents and significantly surveillance that it uses to back up this idea of Japan's proactive, maybe even preemptive approach.
It mentions one specific incident, the closest Japan came to an attack.
That's right. It describes the brutal torture and murder of 7 Japanese citizens in Bangladesh back in July 2016. 5 men, 2 women.
And the reason given in the source?
The source states it was because they couldn't recite passages from the Quran.
Horrific. And the source seems to link this event, or the general climate, to a legal decision in Japan.
It does. It highlights a Japanese Supreme Court ruling. According to the source, this ruling dismissed a legal challenge that was trying to stop the profiling and surveillance of Muslims living in Japan.
So the highest court effectively okayed it, based on the source's account.
Yeah.
How did people even know this kind of surveillance was happening?
Well, the source says it came out because of a big leak back in 2010. Over 100 internal documents from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department apparently got leaked online.
A leak. Okay, and what did those documents show, according to the source?
The source claims they revealed the police had built these incredibly detailed profiles on 72,000 Muslims.
72,000. What kind of details are we talking about?
Really personal stuff, according to the source. Bank account statements, passport details, records of where people went, who they met.
Wow, that's quite extensive, if true.
Very extensive. And the source adds that the leak also reportedly showed police had done things like planting cameras inside mosques.
Inside mosques.
Yeah, and using undercover officers to infiltrate Islamic nonprofits, halal shops, restaurants. That's what the source alleges based on the leak.
Okay, so this leak happens. The court apparently approves this kind of blanket surveillance, as the source calls it.
Yeah.
What was the public reaction in Japan, according to the source?
This is another key point for the source's argument. It claims the Japanese media was basically silent.
Silent.
Yeah. No protests, it says, no big marches in the streets, no angry editorials, no calls for open borders or anything like that.
So the source portrays it as just accepted.
Essentially, yes. It calls it a non-issue domestically. And it ties this lack of reaction back to its earlier points that concepts like racism or group-based grievances don't resonate or aren't seen as legitimate in the same way within Japan, allowing the state to act this way without significant pushback.
All right, that connects back. Okay, so let's try and pull all these threads together. We have the source's description of the cultural identity framework, their very small Muslim population estimate, and then this quite detailed account of security measures, surveillance, court rulings, and the alleged lack of domestic outcry. What's the source's final takeaway, its main conclusion?
The source frames it as a conscious decision. It argues the Japanese government has actively chosen to protect its citizens from the ravages of Islamic jihad. It uses strong language there, claiming jihad has taken tens of thousands of lives globally since 2001.
And it contrasts this choice directly with the West again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It suggests Western countries, well, seem preoccupied with doing what the source dismissively calls virtue signaling during that same period.
And it brings back the Sadiq Khan quote one last time, doesn't it?
It does. It kind of circles back and suggests, maybe a bit pointedly, that the London mayor might want to visit Tokyo.
To see what, in the source's view, they're doing right.
Exactly. To see how they are keeping their citizens safe, contrasting it directly with his part and parcel comment about life in London.
And the source finishes with a sort of disclaimer, but also a warning.
Yeah, it includes the line acknowledging not all Muslims are terrorists, which is, standard. But then it immediately follows with the claim that To deny that there is a specific problem emanating from Muslim communities worldwide would be willful ignorance of the most deadly kind.
So it ends on a very strong cautionary note from its perspective. It definitely puts forward a very specific and some might say controversial explanation for Japan's different experience.
It certainly does. The source weaves together its arguments about Japan's cultural self-definition, the demographic reality it presents, and these reported government security actions into one narrative explaining, from its viewpoint, why Japan has been spared these attacks.
Okay, so just to recap the source's main points we've discussed, that unique cultural view of identity, Japanese versus non-Japanese, the source's estimate of a very small Muslim population, and the government's documented and apparently accepted approach to surveillance and security that emerged from that leak and court case.
Right. And drawing only from the perspective laid out in this source, perhaps something for you, the listener, to think about is this. How might a society's core ideas about who belongs, when combined with specific population numbers and the kinds of government surveillance and security policies described here, create a particular national security reality? What does this specific source suggest about that interplay in the case of Japan?